Yes, good to be with you here. What should we talk about today? I made a little list. How about AIDS, abortion, Iraq, flag burning, drugs, crime, budget, PLO, Israel, terrorism, savings and loan, health care, Social Security, education, Soviets? How about the H-bomb, POWs, ET, environment, prayer, corruption, homeless, unemployment, animal rights, gun control? Any others? Well, let's see. USA Today says that we have 19 cities that have set all-time records for heinous crimes, meaning murder, armed robbery, and this type of thing. Here's an article that says 1 in every 4 people in the continent of Africa has AIDS. Here's another one. It's full page. I kind of thought it was representative of 1991 America. It says states face record tax hikes, food stamp recipients hit an all-time high, and we're on the brink of war, and Bush pledges swift action. Well, let's see what else we got here. Just a little statistics. People like statistics, I think. We're all the time receiving some kind of poll that says America has never been better off, and 89% of the people support President George Bush. Violent crime is up 544%. Teenage pregnancies between 10 and 14 years up 553%. Sexual disease transmission up 226%. Unmarried living together 353%. Divorce is up 117%. Boy, we are in good shape, aren't we? Well, there is hope, because in USA Today, here is a half-page ad that says Jesus is coming in the autumn of 1992. All right, hallelujah. Well, now here's a newspaper article that says Singapore has a new card of its sleeve, an electronic ID tracks its citizens. And they have a new debit card in Singapore. Here's the article on it. The new debit card requires everybody 18 years or older to register. They get a barcode ID card in which they can use credit debit. It also has an electronic matrix. That's what they call it. The matrix will include every government agency, from traffic tickets to school loans to paying your telephone bill to taxes to whether you're wanted for murder. Whenever you use this card, these agencies are checked electronically. If there is any kind of outstanding warrant against you, the light turns red, and you don't get your 10 gallons worth of gas, or you don't get your groceries. And they also have, it says here, a telephonic arrest warrant now, where when the agency sees on the computer that you are at the 7-Eleven and you haven't paid your traffic ticket or your parking ticket, they simply dial the 7-Eleven and say, hold this person under arrest until the authorities arrive. Well, I got one a little bigger. I blew this one up. This is right out of Time magazine. You see, everybody believes Time magazine. Mikhail Gorbachev is Time magazine's man of the decade. And they give you some kind of an electronic Dick Tracy watch if you take time, so I know that all of you are subscribers. So this is in Time magazine, and it says, Peddling Big Brother. It says underneath that, foreign governments are snapping up surveillance systems that are produced in the West. And here's a comely Thai lass showing her barcoded ID card, which, just like Singapore, only in Thailand, 16 years of older, you're required to register, and this also will serve as a credit or debit card. Well, let's turn now to proposed reforms of the United Nations. This is a government printing document. Let me read you what it says under the title of Committee to Frame a World Constitution. This is the preamble to the World Constitution. I'm just going to read the last couple of lines here. It says, quote, the age of nations must end. The governments of the nations have decided to order their separate sovereignties into one government, to which they surrender their arms. What do you think George Washington, James Madison, John Hancock, Thomas Jefferson, and those others would have thought about this kind of a preamble to the new Constitution. Those are treasonous, and they are fighting words in those days. They ought to be fighting words today. Aha, but here's a nice ad that if you haven't seen it, you will. This ad was in Phoenix. It's going around the United States, and it says, imagine being a citizen under the new world order. And do you know who the keynote speaker is? It says here that Dorothy Nelson, judge for the 9th District Court of Appeals, is the keynote speaker. This symposium is presented as a public service, means they don't have to pay for this ad, by the United Nations Association, the Baha'i Faith, co-sponsored by the Global Interactions and World Federation Association. And it says here, imagine a global society filled with solutions. Oh, what are some of the solutions? Well, this one just came like 2 days ago. It is sent to all who own an automobile in Arizona. This is from the State Farm Insurance Company. How many of you have State Farm here? See, some of you do. And so if you're in Arizona, you've already got this. Because here's what it says. It says the Arizona House Bill 2098 requires insurers to provide policy owners with a special identification card which can be scanned by optical character recognition equipment. This endorsed scannable card must be presented in order for you to register your vehicle once a year. Well, what does that mean? Let's go back in time a little bit. Here's another one. This time it is New York Times, and it is March of 1990, and the U.S. Senate is considering the adoption of an identity card for every American citizen. Now, what does all this equate to? Well, the purpose of this talk is to present you with a number of vignettes, any one of which you can choose to verify and get involved with, because all of them concern you. I'm an intelligence officer. All I've done since I've been an adult is work behind the veil of national security. But unlike some intelligence officers, I remembered the oath of allegiance that I took. And the oath, when I raised my hand to the square, was to bear true faith and allegiance to the United States of America, to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That does not mean covering up for my boss's wrongdoings. That doesn't mean shredding documents. It doesn't mean lying before the United States Congress. And so I have decided to lift the veil of national security and reveal what is not being kept secret from the Soviets anymore, because Mikhail Gorbachev is our man of the decade. And the Soviet system has gone belly up, obviously. And Mikhail now is looking for a $100 billion loan. So who are the secrets being kept from? From you, from us, the United States. Exactly. And so this whole thing about cards, well, okay, you're from California, most of you. California, pick this one out of the California paper, offers the nation a model ID card. Now, where are we going with this thing? Well, this gives us a little bit of an idea. Here it says school children are using debit cards now. This is an experiment in Milford, Connecticut. And a little guy named Guy Duarte, I hope Guy Duarte lives long enough and we still have a constitutional system long enough that we can vote for this guy, so he gets my vote for president. They asked Guy Duarte what he thought, because you take your card and you run it through the scanner, and if it turns green, you get lunch. If it turns red, you don't. And Guy Duarte says, quote, "I think it's dumb. What happens if your ticket shows up red? You don't get lunch." Guy Duarte is pretty prophetic, isn't he? Now, on Guy Duarte's level, we're talking your ticket showing up red, just like I have illustrated already in the media in just the last month or two, In Singapore and in Thailand and in other nations, this is going on right now, and the whole idea is to lead to what Consumer Report calls the New World debt cards. Because very rapidly we are moving toward a system where there is no jingles in your pocket, there are nothing that folds. It's all plastic and it is all controllable, and I think this is part of what it means to be a citizen in the New World Order. So I'm going to talk about my experiences personally behind the veil of national security, because we as soldiers, as special forces soldiers who are part of the secret forces of America, are the mechanics. We are the hammers. We're the screwdrivers. We do the wet work for the New World Order. And we do it with enthusiasm, because if I had not joined Special Forces as a young man, I'd probably been in prison. I had a lot of initiative. But what can a kid who's 18 years old, who has a lot of initiative, can he do in the world today? Well, in Special Forces, they teach you how to crack safes, how to pick locks, how to fly airplanes, how to fall out of the sky like bird manure, how to swim underneath the ocean. They teach you how to break 6 bricks with a single blow and blow up things. And for this, I've been highly decorated many times, rather than being put in prison. So it was a very exciting life. I'm just telling you the truth, and I am going to tell you the truth until they run me off of this platform. The point is that you have many young enthusiasts, like a young Bo Gritz, who comes from the great state of Oklahoma, who was raised on Bible Belt Christianity, had a dog that was my best friend along with my grandma, and who literally grew up from the time I was 5 years old carrying my own rifle. You grow up hard-headed. I got shot in the back of the head in Vietnam. Literally, the bullet bounced off. We don't wear steel helmets. In Special Forces, we wear green berets. I'm certifiably hard-headed. But there's something that happens to young men like me, because you also have this feeling. I think it came from my grandma. You know, different than today. When I came home, my grandma was always there. Now, my folks were all fighting the war. My dad died in World War II as a B-17 bomber pilot. My ma flew as a ferry pilot, and so everybody was gone except Grandma. And my granddad was a truck driver. But when I came home from school, if I popped the door open and said, "Mom," and she didn't answer, there was big trouble afoot. And so she was able to teach me how to read when I was about 5 years old. I didn't learn how to read in the first grade. 750,000 graduated this year who could not read their diploma. That's high school graduates. And George Bush is talking about reinventing education. Something very insidious has been going on behind your back. Both of us are kind of like Rip Van Winkle. We've been asleep for a long time. I've been on the other side of the veil. You've been out here. You're waking up now, and what you're asking is, what has been going on in the last 30 or 40 years while I have been doing other things? And what I'm doing is, having done my wet work as a mechanic of the New World Order, I'm spreading the veil saying, what in the hell is going on out here? For the last 30 to 35 years that I've been back there plying my trade craft. And so I think together we're educating each other, and I think together we're going to wake up and we're going to do something that will reverse the New World Order. Otherwise, friends, it is like looking down Westmoreland's tunnel and seeing the light and finding out it's not New Jersey, but instead it's a freight train, and it's headed this way, and it's going to sweep you and all others who won't be prepared away. There's only 3 kinds of folks in this world. There's those who wait for things to happen, and that's probably 90%. There are those who make things happen, and there are those who wonder what happened. You should, in all sincerity, count yourself among the very small minority, and because you're here, I believe that this is a leadership symposium. We're not here to entertain you. You get that on the 6 o'clock news. You get that Thursday night with The Simpsons. And have you ever kind of figured out how it is that Severai and all of these other main people in the media make about the same as Joe Montana and about the same as Sylvester Stallone? They're all in the same business. It's called entertainment. But we're not here to entertain you today. I know each one of the speakers who are going to address you, each one of us has a message. Not all of you will be motivated toward all of the things that we have to speak about. And that's why I say I'm going to give mine in a series of vignettes. You decide what's best for you. And let me give you just a little hint how to go about it. As a trained intelligence officer, my wife often says, "Bo, you're so gullible. You just believe anything that anybody says." As a trained intelligence officer, my arms are out. I want to get my arms around all of the information that is available. But now doesn't mean that I am naive. Once I've got my arms around all the information that's available, then I begin a very careful process of verifying every shred of that information. And those things that I can verify as true, I hold to. Because in the end, no matter what the media does or anything else, truth and reality will bear out. And the rest of it, I discard. So I invite you, I'm going to give you a lot of information. I invite you to get your arms around it, and then you check any of it you want to, because the information I'm giving you is information I have already verified. In 1964, I went to Vietnam in command of a mercenary group. As a matter of fact, in 1976, there was a guy by the name of Francis Ford Coppola. He was going to do a movie. It was called Apocalypse Now, otherwise known as Apocalypse. There's all kinds of names for it. It was the first Vietnam movie. And, gosh, I got a letter through the Pentagon from Coppola, and he said, "Bo, I want to use the photograph out of General William C. Westmoreland's memoirs. It shows me with a nurse toy." Because we had equal opportunity long before it was in vogue here in the United States. This was 1965 that photograph was taken. And we are kneeling in front of some really rugged-looking Cambodian mercenaries dressed in tiger suits. And said, "We want to superimpose Marlon Brando's face over yours because he's Colonel Kurtz commanding an army of Cambodians, and we want to use that as our promotion." The Pentagon said, "Bo, we don't recommend you do this because the Army's not cooperating, because Francis Ford Coppola doesn't want to portray the United States Army in our very best tradition and uniforms." And so I didn't cooperate, but it was kind of a cute letter. The point is that the movie was correct. I did command an army of Cambodians. I was not their advisor. I picked that army of Cambodians because they were the most loyal to the Americans and the most ruthless that I've ever known in my life and my travels. I speak Swahili. I've been to East Africa, West Africa. I was commander of special forces in Latin America. Same time George Bush headed the CIA. I know Manuel Noriega personally and what's behind all of that. I've been into Burma and Southeast Asia. I speak Chinese. I've ricocheted almost all over this globe in the remote areas. I can't tell you a lot about what the Fontainebleau Hotel looks like or Brussels, Belgium, but I can sure describe the jungles of Burma and Nicaragua and Vietnam and Africa to you. Point is that I commanded that army of Cambodians, and we went into denied areas. Denied areas were areas where there was no official war. And we were paid by CIA funds, and as a young major, I didn't care where the money came from, because my focus was on doing as much damage as I could to the enemy. And that's what I did best, and that's what I loved doing. And I didn't care. But the CIA also didn't care much because they were using illegal narcotics in order to pay for such mercenary operations. And where did they get their license? Well, there was a guy named J. Edgar Hoover, who was the conscience of America. For the younger people, he was Mr. Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., FBI. He was the conscience of America. J. Edgar Hoover said, quote, "We don't care about people who use heroin. They are un-American. and mainly in the black ghettos. It gave the CIA license, friends, back in the early 60s to begin to deal in illegal narcotics in order to provide a slush fund to pay for any covert operation that the U.S. Congress would not appropriate money for or approve of. And in fact, in 1962, the United Nations said no American forces in Laos. But there were 600 Americans that were lost in Laos. 308 of them were captured by the Pathet Lao, and not one has ever returned. And Henry Kissinger, a man who should be tried for treason, who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973, knows that he left those 308 to die alone in the hands of the enemy. And so for 15 years, this government fought a war that literally was non-winnable. In 1969, I worked as a special operations commander for the highest military elements in Vietnam. I worked for General William C. Westmoreland, I worked for General Abrams, and I worked for General Wyant. Fred Wyant called me into his office. He's a good, tall Texas gentleman. He, I think, was doing the very best he could. And he said, "Bo, stop trying to win the war." I had just requested from General Wyant that he give me the prisoners that would volunteer out of Long Binh jail, because I had a Cambodian army. I don't speak Cambodian. On our missions, I got more fire from behind me a lot of times than I did in front of me, because these little turkeys were squatting down when they should have been advancing. And my explanation was, if I had Americans, at least we speak the same language, and I can train them in just a few months to be guerrilla fighters. And he said, "Bo, we can't send Americans where you go." And I said, "What do you think I am? Look at these eyes." And he said, "You are special forces. And you can take those Cambodians anywhere, but I can't send Americans." And then he told me, he said, "Stop trying to win the war." He says, "You're not going to win it, and I'm not going to win it." He said, "Come up on the general staff. Use this war to get ahead of your contemporaries." He said, "Otherwise it's going to kill you." I think Wyatt honestly knew that we never intended, there was no plan in the Pentagon to ever win. Clark Clifford said, Secretary of Defense, there is no plan to win the Vietnam War. Johnson said, remember, they don't even bomb an outhouse without my personal permission. What does the president know about outhouse bombing anyway? Generals in the Air Force specialize in it. Is it any wonder that we didn't have a chance? You're going to hear Simonette, a fighter pilot from Vietnam, after me, and he's going to tell you about some of the restrictions that were just absolutely ludicrous. Point is, why were we in there for so long, the greatest nation on the face of the earth? We broke the back of the Japanese war machine. We crossed the Rhine. Who the hell ever heard of Vietnam? And all of a sudden, the greatest nation on the face of the earth is completely stalled. Well, for good reason. Do you know that Bell Textron helicopter lost 5,000 helicopters shot down in Vietnam? Just in Hueys alone. What would have happened if we didn't have Vietnam? They might have gone broke. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, just before he's assassinated, signed an executive directive that would pull out the 50,000 advisors in Vietnam in 1963, and as soon as he was assassinated successfully, then Mr. Johnson he rescinded that executive directive and increased the forces to over 500,000. But boy, the guys that made the bullets and the bayonets and the beams and the boots and the bombs, they were making out. Every dollar spent, and if you'll buy any almanac at any 7-Eleven, you'll see the Vietnam War is the occasion that broke the financial back of America. Your back is already broke. Maybe you're not feeling it yet, but you will. You'll look and you'll see our financial record, and in Vietnam it starts to skyrocket. And then Jimmy Carter came along in 1976 with Paul Volcker and authorized fractionalized banking. And the next thing you know, America is a dead duck because debtors are not choosers. unless, like a fellow in the past named Jesus Christ, turned over the tables and made them start the game all over again. And that's what I believe can happen, because the only nation in the world who has a government of, by, and for the people is right here in the USA. There's no place to run to. This is our country, but the politicians will only do what you require them. They see the light once they feel the heat. They only feel the heat if you build a fire beneath them. Now, I know it's tough, because in California, your senator is governor, and you got another Senator Cranston who's given it up. So you don't have much representation. But you do have personal representatives, and you are a great state, one of the very greatest in the United States. You've got more voice. You're furthest, other than Hawaii and maybe Alaska, but your voice can be heard, and it's going to be very necessary. So I'm going to give you some ammunition in these vignettes, and then I want you to pick up whatever ammunition you feel you can best launch at the enemy. And I think there's one more hill to take, and I think that hill is Capitol Hill. Now, I have already taken an oath of allegiance, so I don't get to vote. How many of you took the same oath that I did? Defend the Constitution of the United States. Raise your hand. All right, you don't get a chance to vote either. You took that oath, and just because you set down a badge or took off a uniform, do you think that oath went away? That oath wasn't, as long as I wear this, I'm going to defend the Constitution. No, that oath was before God. It was a sacred oath. It was before this nation. So you're already committed. But the rest of you, I think, are committed too. How many of you are between the age, maybe I shouldn't ask this. I'll ask anyway, between 18 and 45. If you're between, I can't hold up my hand, but if you're between 18 and 45, you can hold up your hand. You, whether you know it or not, unless you are on active military service, are a member of the unorganized U.S. militia. That is a law. You are to be prepared to defend the Constitution. That's not a very well-known law, because they're trying to get everybody's firearms locked up and away from them. You can talk to people of Lithuania and Latvia and the rest of these Slavic and Croatian and Baltic nations and ask them what they think about the U.S. Second Amendment, the ability to carry and bear arms. Now, from Vietnam, I left disgusted. I knew that we had dealt in illegal narcotics. Heroin was cheaper than beer in Southeast Asia before the heroin arrived in America. And when was America overdosed? Yeah, in the 60s. How many of you graduated high school in the 50s? Now, that one I can raise my hand to. Okay. How many of you that graduated from high school in the 50s had people in your class that you knew were addicted to illegal narcotics? I can't raise my hand to that one. Anybody raising their hand out there? All right, but you know what it is today. Nancy Reagan said before she left the White House that 90% of the high school seniors had at least experimented with illegal narcotics. This nation has been overdosed. Who did it? Well, again, it started in Vietnam, and what was the justification? We needed to, and this is true. As a substitute high school teacher, I often pose this problem. I'll pose it to you. We're now fighting the war in Southeast Asia again. It is 1965. And the enemy is cheating, and they are bringing all of their manpower materiel into Laos and down and in through Cambodia and infiltrating into South Vietnam. And the rules say we can't touch them. They're using a thing we call the Ho Chi Minh Trail. There is an Annamite mountain chain. It's like the Sierra Nevadas. It's the backbone that separates Vietnam from Laos and Cambodia. And these turkeys are on the other side of the mountains, and they're coming through the passes, and we can't touch them. Now, you be the president. I'll be the director of Central Intelligence. Mr. President, if we are not permitted to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail, this war can never be contained and will never be over. We need your permission in order to commit our secret forces across the borders of Laos and Cambodia. What do you say? A lot of you probably say, what does the Congress say? The Congress won't let us. The United Nations says no. Now what if I tell you, Mr. President, listen, we don't need the liberal Congress's money. We don't need it. We can do it the same way that the French did, and the same way the British did before them. They were the ones that legalized the trafficking of opiates into China. That's one thing that precipitated the Boxer Rebellion. So now, if we don't need Congress that are liberal, can we do it so that we can win this war and stop the rising tide of red aggression? I got a lot of those kinds. Running dogs. You think the communists have got a lot? We got even more than they do. Almost every high school senior taking government or history will raise their hand and say, yes, it's okay. But we lost 58,000 young men and women to hostile fire. We lost 75,000 to drugs. And the nation became overdosed. And in 1973, when Mr. Nixon said we're out with honor, did the war stop? Maybe you're not familiar with an operation called Phoenix. It is an assassination program. It's designed to infiltrate into the enemy's infrastructure. Identify any, not just who are active enemy supporters, but any who would support the enemy, we think, and eliminate them in the vernacular with extreme prejudice. Now, who do you get to do this kind of thing? Is it a college graduate who's looking to make a little money on the side working for the CIA to put him through grad school? Is it someone you'd want to invite home to dinner to introduce to mom and dad? No. You get the slime. You get the criminals. Now, what do criminals do best? Are they integrity? Are they honesty? Are they pillars of duty, respectability, and honor? No. So if I am a Phoenix agent and I'm paid by the number of right ears that I turn in every weekend, and I go to you and I say, how many of you here are school teachers or ever have been? They're a good target. Okay. I go to you and say, I hate to tell you this, I know you're not guilty, but the crazy Americans have got you on a list of communist sympathizers, and it is a hit list. I don't want you to have any problem, but you know how they are. It isn't me, you understand, but if you'll pay me money, I think maybe I can buy you off the list. Otherwise, I cannot really be responsible for your safety. Are you going to give me money? If you do, then you'll have to continue to give it to me, and I'm happy because I don't need to turn in your ear. But if you don't, I have full authority to eliminate you with extreme prejudice, especially if you're somebody that I might not just like because of your color or your job or your education or who your family is or what you might have done to my sister or something. This program claimed the lives, this is the accounted for lives of over 40,000 civilians. I know it doesn't equate to the 200,000 Iraqis that were just killed, but 40,000 individualized hits on civilians were paid for, and the real number is much higher than that. And does this program go on today? Yes, it does. How is the program paid for? Will you find it under the appropriations of the United States Congress? No, but it is ongoing even today. Why does it go on? Because, friends, there is big money in this business. You see, the righteous justification is we must continue to fight communism before it reaches out and strangles us here in America, in the People's Republic of California even. And that's justification. So, if we must do this, doesn't it mean it's okay to deal in illegal narcotics? Because we don't care about people who use illegal narcotics. They're un-American. J. Edgar Hoover said it. But what's the real bottom line? How much money are we putting away in the old Swiss bank account? because that is the real bottom line, always has been. I know a guy by the name of Dick Secord. I don't just know him, I know him well. General Secord was a hero in the Korean War. He was a fighter pilot. He helped run the covert aviation part of the Vietnam War. Dick Secord said with his very own lips, "I think I deserve the $8 million I made off the illegal Iranian arms deal for all my hard work. If you have to pay a patriot, I submit you have the wrong man. Patriots for profit should not be in America." And then Dick Secord, when he was before the Iran-Contra hearing, made the statement when he was asked, "Why were you charging the Contra an exorbitant profit in the arms that were delivered?" And he said, "Well, Senator, we're in business to make money." And the senator said, "Oh, I thought we were in business to help the Contra." And he said, "Well, couldn't we have two purposes?" Boy, patriots for profit. And so we have perpetrated this drug game. Now, in my own individual life, I left Vietnam totally disgusted. In 1969, I came here to California. I used to go to Half Moon Bay because I was an aviator, a flight instructor out of Fort Ord. I'd go over to the Nut Tree. I'd run up to Tahoe. It was a pretty good life. I was still shooting out streetlights sometime because my RPM was redlined, and the Army was trying to detune me by sending me to 77 weeks of Chinese Mandarin. 70, can you believe that? 77 weeks. When you get into 47 weeks, almost a year of nothing but Chinese every day, and they say, "You're going really good, Bo, you only got another 30 weeks. But that's how they detune a demented Vietnam veteran, that they're afraid to turn on to the Pentagon or onto society. I went to the Pentagon as an Army General Staff officer. Then I was assigned to Command Special Forces Latin America. This was 1975. My mission, as you can read in the book, right in the efficiency report, this man is responsible for unconventional warfare. Now, what does unconventional warfare mean? It means sabotage. It means guerrilla warfare. It means escape and evasion. It means direct action missions. These are the pinpointed type missions, the assassinations, the destruction of various facilities or people. And in my job as Commander of Special Forces Latin America, it came to my attention that there was a man by the name of Michael Herrera who appeared on the scene in 1975. Michael Herrera is an interesting personality because he was a Mossad agent in charge of the Wrath of God element of the Mossad. The Wrath of God element is that element that takes revenge on any who cross Israel's interest. And you'll remember the Olympics, where we had a terrible incident, and terrorists in Munich, right on television, murdered some of the Olympians from Israel. Well, Michael Herrera's job was to extend the wrath of God to them, and he murdered a Moroccan in Europe who was a look-alike for one of the terrorists. But, alas, it was the wrong person. This puts pressure on the Mossad. And so they sent Michael Herrera to Mexico City, where he was made their stations chief. Now let's go back and just right in that period of time, remember what happened. Everybody here knows where they were when JFK was killed, right? If you were that old. You do, don't you? Anybody here who doesn't remember who was alive on the earth? You know, the only person that couldn't remember where JFK, where he was when he was killed, was Richard Nixon. Richard Milhouse Nixon was called into the Warren Commission. They said, "Where were you, Dick?" And he says, "You know, I just can't remember." Richard Nixon was at a Pepsi-Cola directors meeting in Dallas, Texas, the day that the president was killed. Well, what else? Let's bring it forward now. What else was going on? In 1973, you might not remember this, but there was a thing called the Yom Kippur War. You do remember 1974. I know where you were in 74. You were waiting in gas lines. Am I not correct? You were waiting in gas lines in 74. This is important. a lot of people can't understand what's happening to this country. But if, as an intelligence officer, you use all information, you especially use historical fact, then you project forward what is going to happen. And that's the value in being an intelligence officer, or having an intelligence officer. And so in '74, you were waiting in gas lines for a oil crisis that was not. But all part of it was this. The Yom Kippur War is the trigger. It's the tripwire. In 1973, at the ending of the Yom Kippur War, they just had another war. The Six-Day War was when? 1968, wasn't it? So they just had two wars. They said, look, enough of this. Israel must be strong enough to deter our enemies. Well, what does this mean? It means intelligence. You've got to buy up the enemy assets so that you are able to know what they're doing, so you can counter-move, or so that you can eliminate them before it is actually done, like in the case of the president of Egypt. How do the Israel Mossad agents recruit agents? Well, I'll tell you, in America, so you can be on the watch out, in America, we are taught not to recruit based on money. Surprised? Because if I say to you, I want you to be an agent for me, and I'll pay you, well, all someone else has to do is pay you more. And all of a sudden, you're their agent, and maybe even a double agent against me. We are taught and trained to recruit agents based on family ties, if we can, or religious ties, or national ties. On those three bases, how many agents would Israel be able to recruit? None, because their enemies are Islamic and there's no family tie. There's no national tie because they want a PLO solution. And there is no religious tie because they're in direct opposition. And so what is the means that Israel recruits its agents? Money. They write the biggest check. Now the Jewish people, if you think you're under hard taxation, the Jewish people pay about 60% tax. Much of it goes to national defense. The Mossad has a fairly healthy budget, but it is nowhere near the budget required to buy up their enemies. So where do they make up the slush fund? Do they do it with garage sales, with car washes and cookie bakes? No. Drugs and guns. This is where the profit is. Now, I'm trying to lead you through the wickets so that we arrive at the right place, knowing what this new world order is and seeing whether we want to be a part of it or not, and what you can do about it as an individual and a nation if you don't like it. So in 1975, we now have a brainchild. In the '74, why do you think we had the big gas problem? Do you think that there was no gas? Listen, the pumps over in Saudi, I've been an advisor to Saudi Arabia. The pumps over there are automatic. They fill up the gas tanks. When the gas tanks are filled, the pump stops. The problem was not in the gasoline. The petroleum was there. The real problem came down again. The Israeli Mossad needs money to protect Israel. And this was part of the brain trust. The whole deal was made that we suddenly said, okay, through the United Nations, you can't use single-hull tankers anymore. You have to have double-hull tankers. You have to have these super tankers. And the only people that control them were the people who just happened to own the oil companies and the banks. And so there was a stop. And we negotiated with the Arabs, because we're a member of OPEC, and we said, listen, if you will increase the oil price, because oil is 25 cents a barrel is 40 gallons. Oil is 25 cents a barrel at the wellhead in Saudi Arabia. Now, is oil a lot more maybe out here in the North Atlantic? Yes. It may be as a couple of bucks to get a barrel of oil in the North Atlantic. But the oil at Saudi, which 30% of the oil comes from those Arab nations, is 25 cents a barrel. And yet what happened to oil? Oil went from like $1.40 to $32 by 1983. And the deal was this: if we will hold off the oil so we can lift the price, if you will invest the profits in selected banks. Now, Standard Oil is associated with what bank? Chase Manhattan. And so here's the deal. You're an Arab, and I am Standard Oil Chase Manhattan. I tell you, listen, we're going to hold off the delivery of any oil to drive the price up. What you do is you have to promise that you will take the profits and invest it in the American banking system. And if you'll do that, we will pay you 10% interest. Well, Arabs say, hey, why not? Well, this is the interesting thing, because we're going to, I hope, put together some pieces of the puzzle to show you historically and factually where we're at today and why. The Arabs now give, let's say, $1 million. I take some oil. Now the oil is up to $32 a barrel, and you've made $1 million. You don't get it because there's just an entry that goes from Standard Oil, $1 million, into your account in Chase Manhattan. Jimmy Carter came along, and what did he do in 1976, besides give away the Panama Canal? He, in 1976, allowed Paul Volcker from the Federal Reserve System to fractionalize banking to where for every $1 million, they could lend out 60 times that much. Now do you see what's going on here? And also, and who owns the Federal Reserve? Okay, well, the bankers own the Federal Reserve, and as a matter of fact, as long as we're there, let me just name you the owners of the Federal Reserve, because who knows, maybe you'll be interested in them. There are 3 owners in the United States of the Federal Reserve: Rockefeller, Goldman Sachs, and the Lehman Brothers. There are 5 owners of the Federal Reserve overseas: the Rothschilds, Lazard Brothers, Israel Moses Schiff, Kuhn and Loeb, and the Warburgs. Those names all seem to come from a single entity. You can see why raising the price of oil so that the money would be invested in American banks, so that fractionalized banking would allow a 60-to-1 dispersal of loans, which are all interest-bearing, of course, and a lot of it goes back to protect the interest in Israel, very frankly. Now, let's get back to things that I personally know about. Hariri shows up in 1975. We follow him very closely because he is the Mossad's chief agent in Mexico City. So my job is to keep an eye on him. He has a plan. Number one, Manuel Antonio Noriega wants sophisticated surveillance devices from the National Security Agency and the CIA. But we won't give it to him because the technology is forbidden for overseas. But we give it to Israel. And so Michael Hariri in 75 came in and sat down with Manuel Antonio Noriega and said, you want these sophisticated surveillance devices? You got them. And so he gave them to Manuel Noriega. This ingratiated him, and he became very close compadres. The next thing you know, they, meaning Torrijos, because Omar Torrijos was the dictator until Hariri and the CIA helped Manuel Noriega to kill him. And then as soon as Omar was gone, Noriega was the dictator. They made Michael Hariri their ambassador from Panama to Israel. Michael Hariri is an Israeli. He's come and he now is their brother, and they say, we love you so much, Michael, we're going to send you back as our personal emissary, as our ambassador to Israel. This is nice and cozy, is it not? Here's the real deal. Michael Hariri came in with a plan to start a cocaine cartel that would use the natural coca from Bolivia and from Colombia, and they would transport it into the United States, and the money would be laundered through the banks controlled by Manuel Noriega in Panama. And so this began. The United States Army was called upon in 1975 to provide watchtowers, as they were called. The operation was called Watchtower. There was a low-level navigation point established near Bogota, Colombia, one near Turbo, Colombia, which is on the border of Panama, and one near Albrook Army Airfield on the Pacific side of the Panama Canal Zone. About a little more than one flight a day, the flights averaged about 40 flights a month, came out of Bogota. Now, why do we need these navigational towers? Because the flights flew at night at low level so that they were underneath the radar mask. And therefore you had to have Army guys out there because they had to man the towers. And nobody knew about it, not even our Sync South, our Commander-in-Chief Southern Command, because they were underneath the radar mask. They landed at Albrook Army Airfield. Manuel Noriega, Michael Herrera were there. The cocaine was taken off. It went through the mafioso cartel, and the money was laundered through the banks in Panama, and the Mossad got their cut, and the CIA got its cut, and Manuel Noriega, he got a little something too. Manuel right now is going through, if he hasn't already completed them, the CIPA hearings. What did Manuel say about 3 months before we sent 22,000 paratroops down to get him? He said, quote, "I have George Bush by the cojones." Why did he say that? Because George Bush was head of the CIA in 1976, when all of this was going on. And George Bush had Manuel Noriega come to Washington, D.C., and he stayed with the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence. And George Bush met with him, both in the Panama Embassy as well as at the CIA headquarters, as well as at the home of his deputy. Would you say that Manuel Noriega had George Bush, if there are any cojones there? I would say he probably does. Why aren't you going to hear about it? Because what happened? Well, in 1976, my best friend, as a matter of fact, Bo Baker, was the commander of the first Watchtower mission in December of 1975. He came to me, he stayed with me. He said, "Bo, there's trouble. We are doing something very fishy here. These CIA craft coming back from Bogota are loaded with drugs, and Manuel Noriega is receiving them." He said, "I think it's a little weird." We began our investigation and determined that it was true. We were aiding and abetting a narco-terrorist organization. And so, my job, unconventional warfare. I targeted Manuel Noriega with one of my A-teams. And, interestingly enough, I didn't receive a coded message that would normally come through electronic means, but I got a visit by the Chief of Military Intelligence. I know the terms are contradictory, but that's his title. He is the Assistant Chief of Staff, United States Army for Intelligence. And his name was Harold Aaron, and he landed, he's a two-star general, and he said to me in Task Force Hawk, which is a super secret communication site in Panama, he said, "Bo, you keep your hands off of Manuel Noriega. He has," this is all quote, "he has immense value at the highest levels." Well, I'm hard-headed, if you'll recall, and I said, how could a drug smuggler and a communist, because he's a close friend of Castro, have any value to anybody? He said, "Bo, the CIA has him on the payroll, making as much as the president." Remember what I told you? You don't pay agents money. You have to give them some expenses. We were giving Manuel Noriega $200,000 a year as a retainer, not counting the literal tens and hundreds of millions that he was scraping off the top for the drugs. Well, being a good soldier, ask not why, just do or die, I did not eliminate Manuel Noriega with prejudice, but that's okay because 22,000 paratroops went down there Christmas last, if you'll remember, and in billions of dollars worth of damage and thousands of lives, they brought Manuel Noriega to justice. And he sits in Miami as a 4-star general, self-appointed, and he is a courted official prisoner of war status. Remember, he declared war on the United States. Anybody declares war on the United States has got a sure thing going. Everybody, look at Japan and Germany and all the rest of them, and they're doing great. They lose the war, they win the peace. Manuel Noriega certainly lost the war, but he is there at your expense. And all of you wait to hear the revelations that will come from Manuel Noriega in his trial. Forget it. There's a thing called the CIPA. You probably never heard of it. Classified Information Procedures Act. I know all about it because they used it on me. And I knew when they brought Manuel Noriega out that he was going to be very surprised, that his lawyers were, because it's called the CIA Act, and it's never used. I may have been, my lawyer found 2 other cases in file history where this CIPA had been used before they imposed it on me. And then the next guy was Ollie North, and now Manuel Noriega. So we're a very exclusive little group. The CIPA says you cannot present one word of testimony, not one witness, not one document that isn't in a closed, secret hearing gone over by the government first. You literally have a mock trial in front of the judge with no jury and no people, where the government can cross-examine you as much as they want. And then the government tells the judge what cannot be said in open court because it would prejudice national security. What is national security a synonym for? Cover-up in 1990. Sure as heck is. So do you think, because Manuel Noriega for this last couple of weeks has been going through his CIPA, do you think he's going to be able to tell his relationship with George Bush in open court? Oh, that would prejudice national security, I'm sure. So you will never hear it. But I'm telling you what the truth is, and I'm telling you why George Bush is right now fearful of some things that are going on. It's not just because of Operation Watchtower and Manuel Noriega, but there are other things in his closet. For one thing, maybe you should know, and you might know a little, but let me tell you a little more, possibly, is George Bush is a member of the Skull and Bones. Why is this important? Well, let's go back, if you will bear with me. That's the trouble with getting an intelligence officer to give you a briefing, because we use these historical facts in order to set the stage for our projections in the future. Go all the back with me to the time when we were fighting for our revolution in 1776. What else was going on while we were fighting for our revolution? Over in Europe, there was a guy named Adam Weishaupt. He created a thing called the Illuminati. The purpose was to, first of all, just overthrow Bavaria. And then it was to overthrow Europe. An act of God revealed all of this, because one of his messengers was riding with the dispatches and the plans and was struck by lightning. And the police said, my gosh, look at this. And so they outlawed the Illuminati. That does not mean it went away. It just went underground deeper. And it's interesting because we see that in the same period of time, we had a man named Rothschild, and others will tell you about this, but very quickly, Rothschild's point of view was, if I control the currency and the credit, I don't care who controls the government, I will rule the destiny of the people. And so he sent his 5 sons to all of the major capitals of Europe, from which they created national banks, and they loaned money so that each country could fight itself and its enemies. And, of course, Rothschild didn't care who won. But then America began emerging after 1776, and he saw, whoops, this is going to become the most powerful nation on the face of the earth. We must break its back, and his weapon is economics. Because if we can break the back of America economically, get them on their knees, then we don't care who rules the government. We rule the people. And so he began. Now, there was in about 1805 a guy by the name of George Wilhelm Hegel. Why is he important? You've heard of Marx, haven't you? You've heard of Hitler. Hegel was their instructor. Hegel was a professor in the University of Berlin, and if you look in your encyclopedia, you'll see George, without an E, Hegel. And he is known for Hegelism. And Marx was his student. And here was his theory. He said, only the elite can rule. All people must and can be controlled. If they are not, there is chaos. Therefore, the elite must rule. The state must always be supreme over the people. And Marx, on the left side, started what we know as communism. And on the right side, Adolf Hitler had fascism. But aren't they both Hegelism? Because the state is supreme and the people are beneath it. And it was Hegel's school that you have a thesis, you have an antithesis, so that you have a synthesis. And that, friends, is known as the New Earth. And is it a coincidence that in 1990, the great Soviet threat, the rising tide, the tentacles of communism, all of a sudden go belly up, and Mikhail Gorbachev is man of the decade? Nobel Peace Prize winner last year. How many trillions of dollars have we spent in order to hold off this hated enemy? When are we going to wake up and see what this is really all about? This guy Hegel, I don't think, has any idea the seeds he planted. Because in the minds of the people like Rothschild and others, it said, the elite are going to rule. All people can and must be controlled. We're going to do it economically. We'll set nations against themselves. They will owe huge debts to us, the bankers. In 1865, what happened? We had a major war, 1861 to 1865. President Abraham Lincoln was offered by the Rothschilds funding, a mere 20 to 30% interest. Lincoln said to stick it up your kilt. He created an economy called greenbacks. No gold, no silver, but no debt. Lincoln was killed. He said you could print $450 million. You know why this is kind of interesting? Because another guy said you could print $4.5 billion in non-interest-bearing currency. Who was that? John Fitzgerald Kennedy signed an administrative directive, a presidential directive that said, I am authorizing the printing and distribution of $4.5 billion in Federal Reserve, not Federal Reserve, but federal notes, non-interest bearing.
United States notes.
Yeah, specifically United States notes. The interesting point is, not only was it in the same dimensions, but they were both killed, of course, because this interacts in a wrong way with the direction the New World Order is heading. So George Bush, how does he come into it? Because in 1832, through the Illuminati and through the Hegelism schools, there was a secret society created in Berlin known as the Skull and Bones. Now, how many of you guys here went to college? How many of you in California? Because, see, California's pretty radical. If you went to college in California and you were part of a fraternity, you probably had to swallow a goldfish. Maybe you swallowed an oyster and they pulled it back up, because that's the way college kids do. When you join the Skull and Bones, you are placed in a sarcophagus naked, and you are born again in the tomb. This doesn't sound very intelligent to me. 15 elitists are chosen every year to be initiated into the Skull and Bones. George Bush was initiated into the Skull and Bones in 1948. Now, this happens at Yale, and so people say, well, it's just a fraternity. How come that you don't join it until you're in your senior year? And you are knighted in your senior year, but once you graduate, you became a patriarch of the Skull and Bones. Every year you're called upon. Their one purpose is to promote each other. I'm going to have questions now in just a minute.
One thing on the John Kerry from
Thank you. You TC stealing a little of my thunder here. I want to bring it up later because John Kerry, point we just made, isn't he a wonderful young man? John Kerry's a Vietnam veteran. John Kerry is starting to hold hearings about our prisoners of war. He's going to get to the bottom of it. You know what's interesting? John Kerry's a member of the Skull and Bones. I wrote John Kerry a letter yesterday. I almost didn't do it, but I know a lot about what's going on with our prisoners of war. I've been behind communist lines 10 times since '82. All the photographs you've been seeing, we've been dealing with all these agents. We know the truth behind the photographs and the agents and the prisoners of war. So I wrote a letter to John Kerry yesterday, and I said, John Kerry, I'm here to help you if you really want to get to the bottom of the prisoner of war issue. I want you to call Admiral Jerry O. Tuttle. He knows the truth. He briefed the president. He's seen the satellite photographs that show American prisoners of war in captivity. And I gave him continued lists of actual smoking gun cases. Now, in the very end, I said, I have a little concern because of a fraternity that you share with George Bush, known as the Skull and Bones. How will this affect your objectivity in this investigation? What do you think I'm going to get back from John Kerry? I put that in as the last sentence because, you see, if you even mention the Skull and Bones, they are supposed to get up instantly and walk away and leave because it is a secret society. Well, most recently, how are we even talking about George Bush here? Because it was in, and here's where I first saw it. This is not Time magazine. This is U.S. News and World Report. It's the other people. But they have a little thing here that says, read my code. And up here it says, Bush speak. I prefer to call anything George Bush says Bush lip. It is better than another four-letter word that I would prefer to use as a paratrooper and an Army Ranger, but Bush lip will suffice. I think it's a new word that could be created to mean anything that was absolutely absurd and ridiculous that comes from politics in this decade. It says here that George was up at Kitty Bunkport coming back, and one of his news friends asked him, oh, Mr. President, do we have anything new on the Iraqi situation? And George recognized him as a bonesman and said, 7, and walked on. Well, some of the guys, said, what is this 7? And the guy said, well, he saw he was trapped. He said, listen, that's Skull and Bones talk. Each year there are 15 that are brought in. And 7 is a negative way of answering because that's a minority. If Bush would have said 8, then I would have known that he did have new information. He said, oh, it's of interest, by the way, that George Bush was invited to New Haven, to the tomb, and he couldn't go because you can't enter unless your Secret Service men are also bonesmen, and so he had to turn him down. He was fined $3.22. And so the news people said, what is this $3.22? Why $3.22? And the guy said, oh, that's secret. I can't say, other than to tell you it means good luck. Well, I'll tell you what 322 means. 1832 is when the Berlin Society was formed. So that is the 3-2. And New Haven was the second chapter. The first chapter is in Berlin. New Haven, United States, is chapter 2. Therefore, 322. Is that good luck? That is a school of Hegelism. That is a school of elitists who are sworn to each other to perpetuate their own fame and fortune. I don't think so. A lot of people, well, by the way, a little history on Skull and Bones. 1917, there was a fellow named Prescott Bush, George Bush's dad. He was a Skull and Bonesman. You know who he went to work for when he got out of the Skull and Bones? Not out of it, but out of Yale. He went to work for Brown Brothers Harriman, a Rothschild banking agency. Brown Brothers and Harriman are Skull and Bonesers. You know who also is Skull and Bones? How about Harry Luce? Who's that guy? Owns Time magazine. Aha, Skull and Bones. And William Buckley. You see him all the time. Have you read my National Review? Perhaps you've seen me on television or read some of my articles. He is Skull and Bones. Don't ever expect any of these people to do anything other than promote their own society. Now, a lot of people say, listen, Bo, we got this thing targeted. We know that the Council on Foreign Relations is the real bugger here. There are 3,000 members of the Council on Foreign Relations. One of my best friends is a member of Council on Foreign Relations. They are not the bullseye. They are not the center of the web. These are people who are willing to do anything that the insiders want, because when my best friend was inducted into the Council on Foreign Relations, he showed me a letter. The letter said, would you join the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, in charting the course of this nation over the coming decades? He was so proud his buttons almost popped off. What would you say if you got something like that in the mail? He could not wait to write in his application and says, I will join the Secretary of State in charting the course of the nation. Do you think that when they want something done by him and they write him a little note, says, oh, by the way, Joe, we want you to do this, do you think he's going to do it? In a heartbeat. He'll fall on his bayonet. He's so proud. But they are not the inner sanctum. What about the hated trilateralists? There are 300 members of the Trilateral Commission, Japanese, European, and American. Are they the insiders? Not 300. But who else are skull and bonesers? The Rockefellers? Yes. And they have, again, their sister fraternity on the other side of the ocean. I think, remember I just named you 8 entities. Why don't I call them people? Because they are families. They are a living thing. I honestly believe that there is a conspiracy. If you don't believe there's a conspiracy, get your head out of rectal defilade, get it up where you can see, because your posterior makes an excellent target. Your pockets are getting lighter. On television, about California, this morning in the news, there's nothing but all of the unemployment and how people are losing their jobs everywhere. 800,000 businesses closed their doors this last May. 400 banks have failed in the last 6 months. It is exciting, friends, because the New World Order is upon us. The reason it's exciting is because I have this feeling. I have intelligence. I have knowledge that in the end we are going to win this thing. Now, I don't know exactly how we do it. But I know that in the end, we do win. And I know that the reason I know we're going to win is because if you're on target, how do you know it? You're catching a lot of flack. If you aren't catching flack, you ain't over target. I really honestly didn't know that we had George Bush by the Quijones. But you know something? Let me just tell you what happened. In 1989, I was tried and I was acquitted. But before that, in 86, I was training Mujahideen Afghan freedom fighters. What were you doing in 86? I mean, you say, Bo, good grief. This is my life. My life is a little different. I've been behind this veil. So when I've been training Mujahideen, it is as natural for me as it probably is for you to be visiting a 7-Eleven. I don't go to 7-Eleven. I live so far out in the country, as a matter of fact, when we go hunting, we got to drive towards town. I got a little airstrip that the airplane sets on. It's right in the front yard. It's my dream. It is my wife's nightmare. There's no pantyhose for 50 miles, literally. It's serious. We live out that far from lost wages. So we're training Mujahideen Afghan freedom fighters. It seems right to me that when we're not doing that, we're over in Southeast Asia, either tracing or preparing to rescue U.S. prisoners of war. It's what I've done since '79, when I put on the suit as an intelligence agent of ISA. And we get a call from the National Security Council, and it's Tom Harvey. And this is no big deal because he's a contact that I know well in NSC. And he says, Bo, we have a mission for you. Come to Washington. So we go, and Tom Harvey says the vice president has it on good authority that Kun Sa, the overlord in Burma, is holding American prisoners. Who was the vice president in '86? George Bush. And no U.S. government agent had ever been able to go in the Golden Triangle and come out alive. And they wanted to know if I'd go in there. You think somebody's trying to get rid of me? Kun Sa drew and quartered his men between horses, the White House report said. He killed his barber because he gave him a bad haircut. There was all kinds of nasty reports. But if there was a live prisoner of war even possible, it's worth the risk. Always has been, always will to me, as long as God allows me to stand upright. And so we went. Bottom line is, Kusaw had no prisoners, but he wanted a message on video taken to the president. Well, we're there, and we're cranking away, and he says, tell President Reagan that I will eliminate all of the heroin from the Golden Triangle. Now, that was 600 tons in 1986. Here is the L.A. Times in 1991. And the L.A. Times just let me show now. How much was it in 86? Test question. See if you're listening. 600 tons. Listen to this. According to the U.S. government's International Narcotics Control Strategy Report issued in March, the Golden Triangle produced 3,050 tons. Is that good business? That's 5 times, is it not? Isn't that 5 times? 5 times 600 equals 3,000. That's tons, metric tons, 2,200 pounds. Business is good, isn't it? In 86, Kusaw said, I'll stop every ounce. And he said, I will reveal every U.S. government official who's been my best customer for more than 20 years. Was this good news? We had no prisoners, but yet who was leading the charge in the war on drugs in 1986? George Bush had been appointed by the president. I said, and it was George Bush's office that had sent us to Burma so kindly. And so I rushed back with 3 videotapes and gave them to the White House just before Christmas of 1986. Did they give me an attaboy? No. You already know the answer to that. I was told you erase and forget. Well, something didn't sound right. This plate in the back of my head started heating up, and I said, this isn't right. And so we went back to Burma, and Kusaw named the U.S. government officials, and one of them just happened to be a high-level official appointed by George Bush who was in charge of bringing home the prisoners of war. His name was Richard Armitage. He was the Assistant Secretary of Defense. And right on videotape that you can see, the same tape we turned over to the White House, there is Kusaw saying he is the bag man for the government operation. He deals with the banks in Australia. Well, who is Kusaw? He is the Gorbachev of heroin. If you want to reduce missiles, you talk to Gorby. If you want to reduce heroin, you better talk to Kusaw. That's where it comes from. How come we weren't talking to Kusaw? It told me then why we had failed on 4 occasions to bring home American prisoners of war. It should tell you now why the government is going to try to completely cover up this whole new interest in MIAs and POWs. If Dick Armitage is the bag man for a government drug operation, and Kusaw named the others, you can see it on the videotape, I haven't got time to give you the list, then do we want prisoners to come home? Because if prisoners come home, we're going to investigate what bureaucrats were responsible and what took them so long to get them home. And then what's going to come out? It's going to come out that the bureaucrats responsible were not trying to bring home prisoners, but rather were misusing their office of special trust and confidence in order to run drugs. What better office to run drugs than the one responsible for bringing home prisoners? Because this office goes to all of the agents. It goes to all of the deepest, darkest places of communism. It talks to all of the crooks saying, how about our prisoners? Can we get them out? Isn't that kind of a nice vehicle for also running drugs? And apparently that's exactly what happened, because Armitage didn't start this in 1986. Armitage had been associated with the CIA since 1973, and the Phoenix program and all that's still going on today. Now, when we brought all this back, I was told, if you don't erase and forget, you will serve 15 years as a felon. I was told, on the other hand, if you will cooperate, we will give you a job as a government contractor in Washington, D.C. My wife comes from D.C. Mama is there. It's a great attraction for Washington. And your children deserve this. No one wants to hurt a war hero. Don't make the government go drama. These are all quotes. The fact is that we will bury you. There will be, quote, aggravated charges and hostile witnesses. Just cooperate, Bo. Erase and forget. Well, what would you have done? I'm hard-headed. See, you may not be able to take a bullet in the back of the head like I did. And so, remembering my oath of allegiance, I told them to stick it up their kilt. And sure enough, they tried to keep their promise. But here's what I want to share with you. We are not a nation of sheep. We are a nation of, by, and for the people. I have perfect confidence in the justice system. I have no confidence in the Justice Department. Edwin Meese one day is Chief of Staff of the White House. The next day he's investigating himself as Attorney General. And the rat is guarding the cheese. But what happened? Let me tell you how this population of America can take this nation back any time it wants. Passively, if not directly. In Oklahoma, the charge against me was training the Mujahideen, the Afghan freedom fighters. The grand jury failed to indict. Now, what happens there? The U.S. attorney has no choice. How come a bunch of dirt farmers from Oklahoma would fail to indict? You can indict a stick. The great senator from Utah, Orrin Hatch, said so. There's no defense. It's only the U.S. attorney. And you know, the U.S. attorney now can lie about you before the grand jury and not be held liable about it. He can tell the grand jury anything and not be held liable. That's the law. There was a guy, because I'm not a person to wonder what happened or wait. As soon as I got a letter from the U.S. attorney of the state of Oklahoma that says, you are the target of our grand jury indictment, we intend to request the maximum penalty, which is 5 years. I didn't wait around. They didn't invite me to appear. I went to Oklahoma. I didn't know what I was going to do. But you see, God works in strange and mysterious ways. Something told me, you go to Oklahoma and I'll open a door. When I got to Oklahoma, I stayed with a friend, and you know, a guy just stopped by that night who happened to be a disc jockey on KJIL. Call sign letters for Jesus is Lord. And he said, Bo, if you will come down to the station right now and record your story about this Afghan fighting and how the State Department set it up, I'll play it over and over on KJIL instead of the religious music. Those old farmers out there, yeah, those old farmers out there chugging along. You see, the wonderful thing about miracles is they're so damned unpredictable. You don't know how you're going to win, but somehow you do if what you're doing is right. And in that case, the U.S. attorney could do nothing. The grand jury just said no. So then in California, down in L.A., they were going to indict me. I'm guilty of all these things, by the way. They were going to indict me for violation of the Neutrality Act. 10 times I'd been behind communist lines, never had permission, in search of prisoners of war. So that is violation of the Neutrality Act. It's okay when you're working for the agency, but when you cross them, all of a sudden it is now time that you are brought before the jury and you're tried. God be praised. The little people are for us. There's a guy by the name of Freddie Rusty Capps, who's special agent in charge in Los Angeles. Freddie Capps went to Dwight Moore. Dwight Moore is the U.S. attorney down there, and he said, Dwight, Bo Gritz is an active agent of the United States Intelligence Agency. And he said he won't tell me exactly who he works for, but the CIA has sent me messages to give him. I have investigated things that he has said, and he said the defense intelligence, he denies it all, but I know that it's there because the CIA tells me it is. So Dwight Moore said, oh, I'm not getting caught between some kind of an agency tug-of-war. So he dropped the charges. Then they indicted me in Las Vegas for misuse of a passport. It is a weenie charge. It's an insult. 30 years I've been doing dirty tricks against the enemy, and all they can get me for is using a false passport. I am guilty. I've used them all of my adult life. And I was indicted. But here's the wonderful thing. Remember this. The grand jury Not one patriot can ever be brought to trial if the grand jury says no. And in this case, I was acquitted. What is most, and as a matter of fact, after the trial was over, the first time you can touch the jury, when the trial was over, two ladies came up to me and said, "Bo, you were in our prayers every day." Two real hulky guys came up and said, "Colonel, go get them." Now, that was a jury of peers. I was, figuratively, bulletproof before that jury. The U.S. attorney, talk about how God works in strange and marvelous ways. You'll see it right on the videotape. The U.S. attorney steps out onto the Foley Federal Building steps, the television is there, wanting to know why, after 2 years of prosecutorial delays, they had no case, and I was acquitted. And he says, quote, "This is not some underling. This is the U.S. attorney." By the way, the chief deputy was named L.J. O'Neill. That may not ring a bell, but how about Country Joe and the Fish? And if that doesn't ring a bell, then 1, 2, 3, 4, what are we fighting for? It was one of the best songs in the Vietnam War. Be the first one on your block to have your son come home in a box. We loved it. We sang it over in Vietnam all the time. L.J. O'Neill turned out to be the manager of Country Joe and the Fish. I didn't know it, but when the media got a hold of the Fish and said, "What would we say if you told you your boss was now a deputy chief U.S. prosecutor?" They said, "No. L.J. was too good of an acid head. He'd never do something like that." So L.J. was history. And then the U.S. attorney stepped out and literally said, quote, you can see him, his head is right there, because he was on television that night, and thank God for the Japanese and their VCR. I just recorded it. He said, when they said, "Why were you doing this?" he said, quote, "George Bush called me up and told me to get Bo Gritz." And a young reporter said, "Are you denying that? Is that what you're saying?" And Bill Maddox said, quote, "No, what I'm saying is George Bush called me up and told me to get Bo Gritz." Is that manna from heaven? I recorded that, and I sent that to George Bush with a little yellow stickum right on the top of it, and it said, "If you did this, I think you did wrong. You subverted the justice system. If you didn't, you got trouble with your U.S. attorney. He's lying about you." They fired the U.S. attorney. We still do not have a permanent U.S. attorney. The current U.S. attorney in Nevada is being investigated for arson fraud. So if you know a good lawyer who's looking for a job, you think he can stand muster, send him to Nevada. The point I'm trying to make is that you don't have to be afraid of the government. As a citizen, there's not one law that any idiot in Congress can pass that has any teeth unless the grand jury and the jury gives it force. That's how they did away with the Runaway Slave Act. Now, a lot of terrible, let me kind of wrap it up because I want time for some questions, and then tonight we'll have a full-blown question and answer period. Some things maybe you've been wondering about, and first of all, this prisoner of war thing. There are live prisoners of war. There's no question about it. I want to give you the ammunition. Right here is the best thing that's happened to America other than bringing home prisoners of war alive. This is dated the 23rd of May, 1991. Please write this down. You need this as ammunition. 23rd of May, 1991. It is from the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It is called an examination of U.S. policy toward prisoners of war. Now, you need that because when you call up whoever it is you have elected or who's standing in for somebody you've elected in the great state of California, you need to cite this. You need to say, reference the U.S. Senate study on prisoners of war dated 23 May, 1991. Here's what this says. This study says, we want to collect any questions. This study says, number one, that the Soviets, this is very important, the Soviets in World War II liberated over 20,000 Americans. Let's get the numbers right. 20,000. Americans that were being held by the Germans on the Eastern Front. But they did not repatriate them. This Senate study says they took the American prisoners of war back and put them in KGB gulags and wanted $6 billion in 1945 dollars from the United States in war aid for the return. But we didn't give it to them. So they kept the 20,000 Americans. This study says that in Korea, there were upwards of 5,000 Americans who put on a uniform, who were captured, that were sent through Manchuria into the Soviet gulags. In 1953, there was a guy by the name of John Noble. He escaped from the gulags, and he said, I was being held with 3,000 Americans from World War II and Korea in the gulags of the KGB. This study says that hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans were sent from Southeast Asia into the KGB gulags. In 1975, a man by the name of George Rizu, a Romanian, escaped from the gulags. He said, I was personally held with 900 Americans from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Now, why is this exciting? Because paper does nothing. It's exciting because the U.S. Senate has finally said it. And it's exciting because this coming week, George Bush meets with Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev wants $100 billion. And George Bush has said it's in our best national interest to help him. Here is the message, friends. Please, Monday, I know, write it down if you don't mind. Monday, if you call your senator or your representative or the White House before 8 o'clock. Well, what time is it in Washington when it's 8 o'clock here? It's 11. They're just getting to work about that time, so they should be there to receive your phone call. At 7:30 in the morning here, before you go to work, it only costs you a quarter. Call your senator, call your elected representative, and say this: not one dime to Mikhail Gorbachev until he accounts for our prisoners of war. You see, before Mikhail Gorbachev was man of the decade, before he was Nobel Peace Prize winner, who was he? Head of the KGB. So he either knows directly about these prisoners or he has access to the information. Does he not? And do you know something? If Mikhail Gorbachev honestly thought he was not going to get one thin dime from America unless he returned American prisoners of war and accounted for those that had died in captivity, we'd have them home before Christmas. That's why the Soviets hold them, so that they can be used only when needed as blue chip trading stamps. The White House opinion poll number is 202. That's Washington, D.C., so if you forget it, no problem. It's 202-456-1111. Boy, you'll never forget that number. I bet I come back here 3 years now and say, if America's still around, and say, what is it? And you'll say, 202-456-1111. George Bush will not answer the phone. He's probably at Kitty Bunkport, but someone will. You tell them, please, reference the U.S. Senate study, May 23, 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev gets not one dime until that former head of the KGB accounts for our living prisoners of war and our missing in action. If enough of you do it, I was chief of congressional relations in the Pentagon. I'm here to tell you, politicians see the light when they feel the heat. Feel the heat by your building the fire. That is the solution. The motto in Washington is do nothing and you do nothing wrong. Now, a little food for thought before they give me the wave off. How many minutes have I got? Okay, I want to just pose this to you because I've been giving you these vignettes about drugs and about prisoners of war and about dirty government and the skull and bones. Let me give you something else. I've run government assassination programs. We have some marvelous weapons. The Israeli Mossad chooses to use poison. That is their signature. Somebody drops dead from, look like a heart attack or poison is probably the Mossad. We like, because of our Western heritage, to use bullets. They don't have to be silver bullets, but we have gas projectiles that shoot flechettes. We don't use silencers. That's old Hollywood stuff. We use bullets that are silent. The bullet itself makes no noise. We have atomic bombs, literally, that fit into briefcases. They used to be a little larger in the 60s and even in the 50s. We had a bomb that looked like, kind of like a miniature pot-bellied stove. And I won't get a chance to tell you about all this. It's in the new book that is out now. It hadn't been delivered to us, but it's done, and it's coming. You can read about that. The book is entitled Profiles in Conspiracy from JFK to George Bush, Call to Serve. It is every one of my unique experiences as an operative behind the veil concerning the Kennedy assassination all the way up to, and let me just very quickly present this with you. A lot of people say, I just can't believe this conspiracy business. Who was Jimmy Carter? He won What's My Line. Nobody knew, remember What's My Line, the TV show? Nobody could guess he was the governor of Georgia. But who runs Time Life magazine? Mr. Luce, Skull and Bones. Jimmy Carter was a trilateralist of David Rockefeller. They put his face on the cover twice of Time magazine, and Jimmy Carter was the president. What was Jimmy Carter's job for Rockefeller? One, to give away the Panama Canal. Don't have time to talk about it, but it's in the book. Secondly, was to fractionalize banking with Paul Volcker, where we would actually be cut down to our knees with this 1-to-60 ratio. Okay, Jimmy Carter was a Democrat. I was in Vietnam. I voted for a guy by the name of Wallace. Because remember what Johnson said about outhouse bombing? Well, Wallace had as his vice presidential candidate Curtis LeMay, Strategic Bomber Command Chief. I knew our outhouse bombing would become far more accurate. Wallace, though, said something. He said, quote, not a dime's worth of difference between a Democrat and a Republican. Wallace was giving us prophecy. Were we listening? Jimmy Carter was a Democrat. Now what happens? We have JFK. Let's remember him. Was JFK supposed to win the election? I was a young second lieutenant. I voted for Nixon. Nixon had been Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years. He had all the experience. Who's this Catholic over here? We couldn't vote for him. Thank God JFK had the mafia on his side because of Sam Giancana cheating in Chicago where they had the vote and a half. JFK won by the slimmest margin ever. And all of a sudden, this outsider, because certainly his dad was an insider, but JFK, being young, I think, in a free mind, he decided, by golly, and then talk about incest. Who did he bring on as the Attorney General? His very own brother. Oh, how horrors of horrors. But they started indicting the mafia at 10-to-1 ratio before. All of a sudden, it was civil rights. They were talking to Martin Luther King. The next thing you know, they had authorized and were printing U.S. notes with no kind of debt established to the Federal Reserve. He was going to pull us out of Vietnam. He was going to destroy the CIA and splinter it into 1,000 pieces. He was not going to go back into Cuba for Pepsi-Cola and all the sugar in the world, the mafia, or anybody else. He had to go. And he went. And now let's just follow the progression a little bit. And we had Tricky Dick. Tricky Dick was never an insider. But follow this. Agnew, remember him? Former governor of Maryland. Why did he resign? There was some implication, never proven, just implication that he had some nefarious dealing with contractors as governor. Who in the hell doesn't? That's why you become governor, so you can get rich off of these contractors. That's my understanding of the game. But Agnew resigned, didn't he? And then we had Watergate. I told you when I first began, the very first schools I went through were safe cracking and lock picking. Watergate, we have professionals. We got Liddy, for God's sakes. We've got these people who will burn a candle under their hand for 10 minutes. You tell me that they pick a lock and they go in the water gate, they put a piece of tape over the bolt so they don't have to pick it coming back out. A guard, true enough, he's probably only making $2.50 an hour. He walks around, he opens the door, whoop, there's tape on the lock. Untapes it, shuts the door, locked. They come around and pick it again and put tape back over it. The guard comes around and says, even a $2.50 an hour man knows something is fishy here. The guys up in the next building with their radios, do they call and say, Liddy, get out of there? No. That, friends, was a Doonesbury setup. That was a comic setup. And so why? Because what happened with Richard Nixon? Now, as soon as Agnew went, who did Nixon appoint vice president? Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller. But there was an old harder-than-woodpecker lips guy by the name in Arizona of Goldwater, and he said, nothing doing. We're not having that trilateralist Council on Relations son of a bitch in as vice president. And by golly, he got his way. Who did they bring in, though? Gerald Ford. Who's Gerald Ford? Second lieutenant to the Rockefellers. Now Nixon goes, we have to pass an amendment to the Constitution because never before in American history have we ever had a president and a vice president that were unelected. These guys were appointed. And who did Ford appoint? Nelson. And they had defanged our good senator from Arizona at that time. Now just follow this a little bit. Who then starts shooting at Gerald Ford? Squeaky Fromm. She didn't hit him, but if she would have, we would have had old Nelson at the wheel, at the helm, and we would have been steered right over the brink to the New World Order long ago. Follow this. Who was Reagan's biggest critic back when they were beginning the campaign in '80? George Bush. Reagan had said he never would accept Bush as his running mate. Then he went to New York, and he met with Rockefeller. He was told in that meeting, the reason I say this is because a man who has first knowledge of that meeting, the name of Cleon Skousen, told me this. He said he was told the only way he would see the inside of the White House was as a tourist if he didn't take George Bush as his running mate. Now, Kitty Calley has put out dirt on the missus. But some of that dirt, even, if some of it is true, you can understand why a movie star, I voted for him twice because I thought he could see the cavalry coming over the hill in the last moments. Seriously, didn't you? Come on, you guys did it too. All right, now Reagan takes on, because he doesn't want the dirty laundry, he wants to win by a landslide. He's a vain man. He takes on George Bush thinking, hey, who's the vice president? Can you name 6 vice presidents? Who's the vice president anyways? Nobody. He was inaugurated January 20th, 1981. What happened March 31st, 1983? 2 things. One is Bo Gritz sent a top-secret special intelligence message to Ronald Reagan at the White House, and wasn't I surprised to watch television and see that Mr. Hinckley had shot up James Brady, the Secret Service man, and the policeman. Do you think Hinckley shot Ronald Reagan? No more so than Lee Harvey Oswald pulled the trigger on JFK. All this is in detail in this new book by Detailed Fact. But I just want you to see how this thing happens. Here we are in front of the hotel in Washington, D.C. Hinckley is firing away. Look at the videotape. Hinckley is using a .38 special. That blows you away. It's what it did. A .22 doesn't do that to you, folks. Again, I'm an expert at this. I've run these programs. What happens? George Bush is in where? Where is George Bush? Dallas, Texas. Isn't that just a little bit coincidental? George Bush is in Air Force One at Dallas, Texas. Ronald Reagan is pushed into the car, remember? And he is whisked off. Brady's laying there. The meat wagon comes, and 5 minutes later, Brady is put aboard and taken to the hospital, George Washington University. Who arrived first? Brady arrived first. How long after Brady arrived did Ronald Reagan arrive? 15 minutes. After Brady arrived, Ronald Reagan arrives. The Secret Service says, quote, we got lost. That is bush lip. I was going to say it's a lie, but it's better to say it's bush lip because it is politically oriented. That's bush lip. Secret Service does not get lost, not in Washington, D.C., not anywhere. They're not supposed to, unless that's part of the game plan. Ronald Reagan says, quote, this is his own words, I didn't think I was hurt until I was inside the car, and the Secret Service man was on top of me. Then I felt a sharp pain in my side, like a hammer hitting me. I thought the Secret Service man's pistol had injured me. That's the words of Ronald Reagan. Now, when they got him to the hospital, he's had some flecks of blood around his mouth. These are all in the newspaper. Just go to the library and pull this stuff up. They couldn't find a bullet. They x-rayed him 3 times and no bullet. Finally, a nurse saw a very tiny entrance wound right at the 7th rib. And then by probing, they were able to find a flechette. Friends, a flechette, we have bullets that make no noise. These are major caliber bullets. These are 30 and 45 caliber bullets that are silent. But that makes a very large hole and a signature. A flechette is projected by a gas-powered gun. And it is, as the doctor said, what I found was a flechette that was thinner than a dime. It was 1/4 inch from his aorta. George Bush was that close to being president by ascension, and our president, Ronald Reagan, was that close to death. Now, I think that that's very real for a movie star. And I think that what happened is when he didn't die, they began to say, uh-oh, what do we do now? I think they were headed for Bethesda Naval Hospital. That's where they worked over Kennedy. And I think when he didn't die, they said, uh-oh. And then somebody said, take him back, take him back. For 20 minutes he's out there driving around while Brady, 15 minutes, Brady's at the hospital. So George Bush, I don't think, has just been in term once. I think he's had 3 terms because I believe when Ronald Reagan said, I didn't know, I think he was telling the truth. I think that as of that moment, Ronald Reagan became a man who read the lines in the White House, and George Bush was the man who was pushing, because the whole purpose is a new canal in Nicaragua. That's the whole thing behind the Iran-Contra. George Bush knows. He knows about drugs in Nicaragua. George Bush knows about drugs coming out of Burma. George Bush knows about the American hostages that were left in the hands of the Ayatollah Khomeini so that Carter would lose the election. George Bush knows about the 8 Americans that died at Desert One as sacrifice during that aborted raid. George Bush knows about a lot of things. If he was head of the CIA, if he was vice president, and actually I think the controller in the White House for 3 terms, if he's president and he doesn't know, he's inept. He and the rest of them, I think, need to be fired. Very quickly, things that I think you can do, number 1 is demand the prisoners of war returned. Gorbachev has the answers. That's something that everybody should be able to get on board with. Number 2 is we've got to federalize the Fed. You'll hear more about that, so I won't say so much on it. The Fed is the 8 entities I named you. They are breaking our back. Debtors are not choosers. Well, I mean legalize it. Now, Kennedy, for example, he just said we're printing U.S. notes. Basically, to hell with the Fed. But if Congress, because the Constitution says that Congress has the responsibility, but if they are so inept that they can't handle it, then let's pay the Federal Reserve green checks and put them under the federal system so we're not paying them debt money. It's dumb to pay debt money, 8% interest on every dollar that is manufactured. Why? To a civilian private banking corporation. Well, the why is obvious, because they're going to break us like Rothschild had always figured on doing. Number 3 is watch out for this ID system. This ID system is a credit-debit thing that is coming. I just read you the beginning. All of the things they're trying to do to come in the back door. They're already doing it overseas. Be careful, because once they get control through the credit-debit system, you're going to be marked, and I think that you're going to be, at that point, over the brink. You're going to be lost. Don't allow any national emergency to be declared in the United States. Last year, they almost declared a national emergency, a drug emergency. Anytime a national emergency is declared, it means you can suspend the Constitution in favor of martial law. We lose the Constitution, we lose our First Amendment rights, we wouldn't be standing here. All these bases they're closing up, you're going to be herded in there if you are a protester. Well, there are national emergencies that are standing there waiting, but George Bush and others don't feel at this time they could get away with it because we are not disarmed. And that is very frankly the truth. There are things that we can do. Remember that there is no letter T on the end of the word American. I want to tell you a little joke that I heard that is very appropriate. You can pass around to your friends. It lets them know what's happening today. A little kid needed money. And so he decided he would write a letter to God. So he wrote a letter and he said, "Dear God, I need $100. Thank you, Johnny." Well, the post office, and he just addressed it to God, USA. God must live in USA. And so the postal department got it and said, "Isn't this cute? A letter to God, USA." They opened it. They said, oh, their heart was touched. They sent it to the president. Who else? And George Bush got the letter, and he opened it. He says, "Oh, this is so touching." He showed it to his wife, and he says, "You know, I'm going to send this kid $5. So he put $5 in the letter, and he sent it to little Johnny. Johnny got the letter. He opened it up. He saw it was from Washington, D.C. It was only $5. And so he sat down and wrote God a thank you note. He says, "God, thank you. I don't know why, but you chose to send the money through Washington, D.C., and the bastards took 95% of it." Now, a final word to you before I step off and Cy gets up here. My whole life, and I wouldn't trade a minute of it. I pray a lot. I'm not afraid of anything on this earth. My religion is that good. But I pray a lot because I'm thankful. I'm thankful to be a pilot. I'm thankful to have the view that I have of this world. I'm thankful for the opportunities that I have. I'm thankful for being alive through the many times that I've been out there on the pushing the envelope on the periphery. And, you know, a lot of times my guys have come to me when we've really been in a tight, and they've said, "Sir, we're surrounded." When we were in Laos in 1983, we got a message from the CIA that said, "You are surrounded, return immediately." It's midnight. We're on top of a mountain. You don't go nowhere in the jungle at midnight on top of a mountain in the middle of Laos, especially if you're surrounded. Well, the next message was, if you don't, because I just said, "Forget it, we're pressing on." And they said, "If you don't return immediately, all support is off." Boy, that's kind of fickle, isn't it? Well, we didn't care because we didn't need the CIA at that point. We were moving toward the target. A lot of times my guys have come to me and said, "Sir, how are we going to make it?" I don't know how I knew that we were going to make it, but I did know. There was just something that said to me in a voice that I understood that says, "Hey, there's a door. You're going to make it." I want to give you the hope that I have and where I got it from. I was a young cadet in military academy in the South, and we had a guy named Major Kelly. Kelly taught me how to pray. Kelly would ask a question, and he gave us in one semester Old Testament, the other semester New Testament. Here would be Kelly's method. He'd open the Old Testament, and he would say, "What is the situation in 2 Kings, chapter 6, verses 11 through 17? And then he would look over the Corps, and we would be praying, because Kelly either gave you a 0 or 100, depending on your answer. And boy, that sure did take down your average quick. We learned to pray. I thought Kelly was trying to teach us the Bible. He wasn't. He was teaching us how to pray. I got close to the Lord by saying, "Please don't let Major Kelly call on me." But do you know what is in 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 15 to 17? There was only 2 verses. It's a verse I've never forgotten because I've been there so many times. You've got a guy by the name of Elisha, and he is a spy for Israel. And the king of Assyria is trying to encapsulate Israel and defeat them. And the king is angry, and his staff is saying, it's Elisha. You don't use the water closet, that he doesn't know and tell. And the king says, well, wipe him out. And so in verse 15, you have the army of Assyria around Elisha. And it's dawn. And Elisha's handyman is up, his aide. And he's scratching under his robe, and he looks out, and here's all the armies like Custer and the Indians. Here's all of the Assyrians in the world. And so he goes back and says, excuse me, master, what shall we do? For we are surrounded by the armies of Assyria. And Elisha, you can just see him in the words of the Old Testament. Without hardly yawning, Elisha says, don't worry about it. There's more for us than there is against us. And I've seen it in the faces of my own soldiers. The guy is saying, there's me and there's you and there's all them guys out there. What do you mean more for us than there is against us? Elisha understands, and then Elisha says, this is what verse 15 says. He says, Lord, open this young man's eyes that he may see. And the Lord does. And what does Elisha's young man see? He sees between the armies of Assyria and them are angels in chariots of fire, and not one hair of their head is harmed. Now, you are an American. You're here, what I believe is the land of milk and honey. It is the new Zion. It is the greatest nation on the face of the earth. We are special, every one of us. We didn't win a raffle in order to become an American citizen. You're here because you're meaningful. Who are we to ever fear anything from the New World Order? If we are striving righteously and we want to do what is right, who is it for us to say that the odds are against us? Open your eyes that you may see, for I believe that there are angels, even with chariots of fire, that will stand between us and the New World Order. And I believe it enough that I'm willing to stand. I certainly am not going to run. There's no greater country. I may go down, but if I do, I'll go down swinging. And I invite you to either lead or to follow, but for God's sakes, don't get out of the way. Thank you. Power.